Marcus and Jessica walked through the front doors of the Naperville Botanical Conservatory at exactly 2:15 on a Tuesday. They dropped their duty-free luxury shopping bags on the limestone floor. They were supposed to be returning from a municipal zoning convention in Arizona, but convention halls don't give you deep, peeling sunburns. They smiled at me, projecting absolute innocence. The trap was set. The Naperville Botanical Conservatory wasn't just a job for me. It was a generational inheritance, a living archive of my family's history built glass pane by glass pane. For my entire life, I had dedicated every waking hour to preserving the rare orchids and maintaining the structural integrity of the historic greenhouse my grandmother left behind. It required meticulous care, precise climate control, and absolute dedication. My marriage to Marcus, the corporate real estate acquisitions director, had supposedly been built on that same foundation of mutual respect. I had believed we were partners. I had believed Jessica, the boutique art gallery owner and my lifelong best friend, was my closest confidant. Instead, they had just spent 15 days together in Arizona under the guise of a municipal zoning convention. When they returned, they immediately slipped back into their usual routines. Marcus complained about his delayed flight while unpacking his suitcase. Jessica called me the next morning to gossip about a client at her gallery. They were flawless in their execution. There was no hesitation, no guilt bleeding into their voices. It is a fascinating psychological phenomenon, the trap of cruel normalization. When people commit profound betrayals, they do not walk around consumed by visible guilt. Instead, they build a psychological firewall. They compartmentalize their actions, separating their deception from their daily interactions. By perfectly mimicking the mundane details of everyday life, complaining about the weather, asking what is for dinner, laughing at inside jokes, they force the victim into a false sense of security. They use normalcy as a weapon, weaponizing routine to make their deceit entirely invisible. They maintain their normal faces through a mechanical separation of emotions. I watched Marcus sit at my kitchen table, drinking his morning espresso and scrolling through his corporate emails. I observed the way his shoulders relaxed, radiating the arrogant comfort of a man who believed he had successfully managed two entirely separate lives. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, and now I realized it had been a subscription, with me footing the bill. I maintained my polite routine, offering him a fresh cup of coffee and asking about his convention itinerary. I did not scream or demand answers. I simply observed the chilling signs of betrayal, gathering data with the same precision I used to measure soil acidity in the conservatory. They were merely existing in a reality where I was the oblivious variable. Every smile they gave me was an audited transaction. Every casual touch was a calculated misdirection. I watched them interact at a weekend dinner, passing the wine, sharing brief, imperceptible glances. I cataloged their movements. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet, and they were about to be audited. I noted the exact timestamps of their texts, the subtle shifts in their body language when the other entered the room. They felt safe in their deception, protected by my presumed ignorance. But my silence wasn't ignorance, it was observation. I was compiling the initial ledger of their betrayal, preparing to close the accounts they had so recklessly overdrawn. The audit began with a single key and a grainy digital frame. Late one evening, while Marcus was sleeping soundly, I opened my laptop. I didn't cry. I didn't ask the universe why this was happening to me. I simply started clicking. The first piece of evidence came from a carelessly tagged photograph on a mutual acquaintance's social media page. It was a candid shot taken in Arizona, showing a bustling street corner. In the background, slightly out of focus but unmistakable, stood Marcus and Jessica. They were standing intimately close near a luxury rental shuttle, his hand resting comfortably on the small of her back. That single image was the trigger. I logged into our joint executive corporate portal, navigating through the billing statements and travel logs. It took exactly 12 minutes to bypass his superficial security measures and access the detailed itineraries. There was no municipal zoning convention, Instead, there was a 15-day reservation at an exclusive desert resort. They had booked a single king suite. The transaction was clear, unambiguous, and undeniable. This is where the invisible chain of the survivor forged its links. When faced with absolute betrayal, the human mind often defaults to denial or collapse. But for those who have spent their lives tending to fragile ecosystems and weathering harsh seasons, resilience takes a different form. It becomes a quiet, unbreakable chain of logic and endurance. The survivor does not lash out wildly. They anchor themselves to the undeniable facts. They channel their devastation into relentless, forward momentum. My resilience was not born of optimism, but of necessity. I recognized the truth and immediately chained myself to it, refusing to be swayed by the emotional weight of their deception. I had spent years protecting fragile orchids from sudden frost. Protecting myself required the exact same methodical discipline. I closed the portal and picked up my phone. I needed unassailable facts, the kind that could hold up in a boardroom and a courtroom. I contacted Evelyn Vance, a private investigator and forensic financial auditor known for her ruthless efficiency. I didn't hire her to find out if they were having an affair. I already had the answer to that. I hired her to document the exact dimensions of their deceit. I needed a complete financial reconstruction of their 15-day Arizona getaway. I needed flight manifests, credit card receipts, and hotel folios. I spoke to Evelyn in a voice devoid of panic or despair. I gave her Marcus's account numbers and Jessica's business details. I laid out the parameters of the investigation with absolute precision. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. By 2 a.m, Evelyn had accepted the contract. I closed my laptop, walked into the bedroom, and looked at Marcus. He was breathing softly, oblivious to the fact that his entire carefully constructed reality was currently being dismantled, line item by line item. The wheels were in motion, and I felt nothing but a cold, calculating calm. The emotional storm had bypassed me entirely, leaving behind a sterilized landscape where only facts mattered. I mentally prepared myself for the days ahead. I would continue to smile, playing the loyal wife, while compiling their ruin. The blueprint of their second life was far more extensive than a simple 15-day desert affair. Evelyn Vance delivered her preliminary findings 48 hours later. I met her at a sterile, fluorescent-lit coffee shop downtown. She slid a thick, highly organized file across the table. The secondary twist she uncovered was not just a betrayal of the heart. It was a systematic, calculated corporate assault on my legacy. Marcus and Jessica had not just been sleeping together, they had been quietly bleeding me dry. Evelyn's forensic audit revealed a series of sophisticated, incremental transfers. Over the past 8 months, they had secretly siphoned over $128,000 from my joint accounts with Marcus. The money had been carefully routed through dummy vendor invoices tied to Jessica's boutique art gallery, masking the theft as legitimate art acquisitions and consulting fees. But the stolen funds were merely the operating capital for a much larger, more devastating plot. Evelyn turned to the next page of the dossier. Marcus, using his expertise as a corporate real estate acquisitions director, had initiated the quiet liquidation of a preservation trust. This was not just any trust. It was the specific financial vehicle tied directly to my late grandmother's historic greenhouse property. The very botanical conservatory I had spent my life protecting was being actively packaged for demolition. They had already drafted preliminary architectural plans. They intended to bulldoze the century-old glass structures, pave over the rare botanical archives, and construct a massive block of high-end luxury condominiums. Marcus had leveraged my signature on seemingly benign administrative documents to initiate the zoning changes, while Jessica had secured the initial investors through her extensive gallery network. They were plotting to sell my family's history to the highest bidder and use the immense profits to finance their new life together. I stared at the architectural renderings, looking at the sleek, soulless condo designs that were meant to replace my grandmother's legacy. Love had been a contract, and now I realized it had been a subscription. with me footing the bill for my own destruction. They had calculated my value purely in terms of real estate and liquid assets. I didn't break down. I didn't let despair cloud my judgment. I absorbed the information with the clinical detachment of a silent investor reviewing a hostile takeover bid. The parameters of the conflict had fundamentally changed. This was no longer just about infidelity. It was a vicious war for my inheritance. I instructed Evelyn to finalize the evidence, ensuring every bank transfer and forged document was legally unassailable. I thanked her, paid her invoice in full, and walked out into the crisp afternoon air. The cold retaliation had officially begun. I had all the blueprints, the bank records, and the precise timelines. Now, all I needed was the perfect moment to trigger the demolition of their lives. I drove back to the conservatory, walking through the humid, earth-scented aisles of the main greenhouse. I touched the leaves of a rare fern. They thought I was a naive botanist, easily distracted by flowers while they stripped the soil beneath my feet. They were entirely wrong. The trap was armed. Marcus returned home that evening, radiating an arrogant, suffocating normalcy. He walked through the front door, loosening his silk tie and dropping his briefcase with the casual confidence of a man who believed his 15-day alibi was utterly impenetrable. He poured himself a glass of expensive bourbon, the very bourbon purchased with funds siphoned from my accounts, and smiled at me from across the kitchen island. He asked me how my day at the Botanical Conservatory had been, his voice perfectly modulated, displaying not a single tremor of guilt. I stood perfectly still, watching him perform. The climax setup required absolute precision. I needed to shatter his psychological firewall instantly, bypassing his prepared lies and striking directly at his primal instincts. I did not mention the $128,000. I did not bring up the luxury condominiums or the illegal liquidation of the preservation trust. Those were strictly business matters to be handled in due time. I needed a visceral, uncontrolled reaction. I looked him straight in the eye, my expression entirely blank, and dropped the line with chilling, clinical detachment. Jessica has HIV. Did you know? The silence that followed was absolute. I watched the arrogant normalcy drain from his face in a matter of seconds. Knowing the exact unprotected timeline of their recent 15-day getaway in Arizona, the crushing weight of panic hit Marcus instantly. The bourbon glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor, splashing amber liquid across the white baseboards. If he had been innocent, he would have asked why I was telling him this. If he had an ounce of rational thought left, he would have asked for medical proof or questioned the source of my information. But absolute guilt breeds absolute terror. His mind bypassed all logic, instantly connecting his secret, clandestine actions with a lethal, immediate consequence. The psychological trap clamped shut with devastating efficiency. He did not deny the affair. He did not ask how I knew about Jessica. He simply began to hyperventilate. His eyes darted around the room as his breathing became shallow and erratic. The self-preservation instinct overrode everything else in his system. Without saying a single word, without even attempting to formulate a lie or a flimsy excuse, Marcus turned and bolted for the door. I watched from the kitchen as he fumbled with his car keys, his hands shaking violently. He scrambled into his luxury vehicle and sped out of the driveway, tires screeching against the asphalt. I knew exactly where he was going. He was fleeing straight to a 24-hour urgent care clinic. I didn't chase him. I didn't yell after his retreating car. I calmly walked over to the closet, retrieved the broom and dustpan, and began sweeping up the shattered glass. The operation was proceeding exactly as calculated. His panic had confirmed everything, and his immediate abandonment of Jessica in his moment of terror would be the key to the next phase. Conflict at 11:51. Retaliation in progress by 11:53. I dumped the broken glass into the trash, my pulse completely steady. The house was quiet again. He had left his briefcase sitting on the counter, an abandoned prop in a play that had just been permanently canceled. The verification and alliance phase commenced the following afternoon. I arranged to meet Jessica at a downtown artisan bistro, a trendy spot she frequented to network with her wealthy art gallery clients. I arrived early, securing a corner booth that offered total privacy. When Jessica walked in, she carried her usual air of curated elegance, completely unaware that her partner in crime had fled to a medical clinic the night before, in a state of absolute undeniable terror. She sat across from me, ordering a sparkling water and flashing her practiced best friend smile. She asked about Marcus, feigning casual interest. I let her perform for a few minutes, listening to her empty pleasantries, before sliding a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a high-resolution copy of the architectural plans for the luxury condos. Her smile faltered instantly, her eyes dropping to the document, the color completely washed from her face. Before she could attempt to formulate a lie, I laid out the exact financial timeline Evelyn Vance had uncovered. Confronted with the unassailable accounting of their massive theft, Jessica's elegant facade completely crumbled. Cornered and desperate, the confession poured out. She admitted everything. She confessed that Marcus had promised they would move away together to a coastal city, funding their extravagant new life by completely selling off my conservatory property and liquidating my family trust. He said it was the only way, she whispered, her hands trembling uncontrollably around her water glass. He said you were too attached to the greenhouse, that you'd never let it go. I listened without a shred of empathy. Then, I delivered the final, calculated blow to their alliance. I leaned forward, my voice cold and methodical. Last night, I told Marcus that you had HIV. It was a bluff, a completely fabricated psychological trap. Jessica stared at me, confusion warring heavily with fear. What? I asked him if he knew, I continued smoothly. And you know what he did? He didn't defend you. He didn't ask for proof. He didn't even say goodbye. He dropped his glass, bolted out the front door, and drove straight to an urgent care clinic to save himself. He abandoned you instantly, Jessica. His only thought was his own self-preservation. The realization hit her like a physical strike. The man who had promised her a luxurious new life, who had conspired with her to steal over $128,000, had discarded her the second he thought his own life was at risk. The grand illusion of their romance shattered right there in the artisan bistro. I watched the deep betrayal twist her features into a mask of bitter fury. The alliance between the two antagonists was officially terminated. She realized that Marcus had used her just as ruthlessly as he had used me. I didn't offer her comfort. I simply gathered my documents and stood up. I had verified the plot, and I had successfully turned her against him. The board was perfectly set for the final execution of judgment. I walked out of the bistro, leaving her alone in the booth to calculate the devastating cost of her choices. The execution of judgment was meticulously scheduled for the annual Autumn Philanthropic Foundation Gala, a high-profile event hosted by Arthur and Margaret Sullivan, Marcus's affluent parents, at their sprawling Oak Brook estate. The guest list included the entire corporate board of directors, major regional donors, and the elite of the commercial real estate sector. It was the absolute epicenter of Marcus's professional and social power. I arrived wearing a sharp, tailored black suit, carrying a thick leather portfolio. The estate was immaculate, adorned with towering crystal chandeliers and expensive seasonal floral arrangements. Marcus, having spent the last few days spiraling in paranoid isolation awaiting test results, looked pale and frantic when I entered the grand hall. He tried to approach me, to pull me aside, but I stepped past him, my focus absolute. The power flip climax required an audience. During the elaborate dessert service, Arthur Sullivan tapped his champagne glass, calling for the traditional autumn toast. As the room quieted and eyes turned to the head table, I stepped forward, taking the microphone from my bewildered father-in-law. I didn't hesitate. I opened the leather portfolio. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed board members, I began, my voice projecting crisp and clear across the silent ballroom. Tonight is about transparency and legacy. Therefore, I believe it is vital to share the recent financial activities of your corporate acquisitions director. I distributed the perfectly organized dossiers to the key board members seated at the head tables. I presented the 15-day hotel folios from the Arizona resort. I presented the forensic bank transfers explicitly showing the theft of $128,000. Finally, I projected the unauthorized architectural plans for the luxury condos onto the main presentation screen, publicly exposing the ruthless asset-stripping plot designed to demolish my historic greenhouse. The room instantly erupted into shocked murmurs. Marcus collapsed into his chair, his face buried in his trembling hands. This is the ultimate illusion of power from an empty wallet. We often believe that manipulators hold true authority, but their dominance is merely a rented facade financed entirely by the resources of others. A manipulator's power is fundamentally dependent on the victim's silence and capital. The exact moment you cut off the financial supply and expose the ledgers, their false authority instantly evaporates. Without my trust fund and my continued silence, Marcus was not a powerful director. He was simply a broke, exposed fraud sitting in his parents' dining room. His parents stared at the bank transfers in absolute horror. The corporate board members exchanged grim, definitive glances. His career, his social standing, and his financial future were simultaneously liquidated in front of the entire assembly. I didn't scream or gloat. I delivered the facts with the precision of a forensic auditor presenting a final report. They were shocked, not by the betrayal, but that I had finally stopped playing the silent partner. I closed my portfolio, handed the microphone back to a stunned Arthur Sullivan, and walked toward the heavy oak exit doors. The retaliation was complete. The accounts were permanently balanced. I stepped out of the estate into the cool autumn night, leaving the absolute ruins of Marcus's life echoing in the grand ballroom behind me. The resolution was as swift and clinical as the retaliation itself. The legal settlement was finalized within weeks, driven by the crushing weight of the unassailable evidence I had presented at the gala. The corporate lawyers didn't even attempt to fight the overwhelming documentation. I was granted complete, uncontested ownership of my family inheritance, legally shielding the historic property from any future corporate interference or zoning alterations. I secured full restitution of the $128,000, seizing Marcus's remaining personal assets and offshore accounts to definitively balance the ledger. The dissolution of the marriage was executed with ruthless, uncompromising efficiency. I stood inside the center aisle of the restored Naperville Botanical Conservatory, the glass panes gleaming brightly above me in the afternoon sun. The rare orchids were thriving, completely unaffected by the chaos that had briefly threatened their soil. The environment was meticulously controlled, safe, and entirely mine. The air smelled deeply of damp earth and blooming jasmine. To those who have always felt like you are on the fringes of your own life, to those who have been treated as silent investors in relationships that only drain you, recognize your own capital. You are not a secondary character or a backup plan in someone else's grand narrative. Often, the people who make you feel invisible are secretly relying on your stability to fund their grand illusions. Do not let them convince you that your quiet dedication is a weakness. The exact moment you realize your own worth, you hold the ultimate power to stop the transaction. You have every right to audit the people in your life, to cancel the subscriptions that no longer serve you, and to reclaim every ounce of energy they have systematically siphoned away. Do not wait for an apology that will never come. Simply close the account, revoke their access, and focus on rebuilding your own greenhouse. I looked at the vibrant green canopy surrounding me. The silence of the conservatory was no longer the heavy silence of a secret kept. It was the peaceful quiet of a ledger permanently balanced. I hadn't just saved the property. I had saved my own future. I've come to realize that holding on to anger is just another way of paying a debt you don't owe. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. I didn't forgive them for their sake, but to clear my own mental balance sheet, allowing me to fully inhabit the peace I had fought so methodically to secure. Autumn had settled over Naperville, bringing a crisp, clean chill to the air. My inheritance was safe, my accounts were restored, and my life was definitively, unapologetically my own. If today's story resonated with you, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on future valuable life lessons. Please share your thoughts in the comments section.